What exactly is investigative psychology? Investigative psychology is a form of applied psychology. That means it is psychology that can be applied to solve real-world problems. Investigative psychology tries to understand offenders' behavior and the decisions they took so that this understanding can be used to assist in the investigation of crimes. It is also about how best to investigate and how the police make decisions when they deal with crime. So it looks at both the offender and the police. The term investigative psychology was first coined by Professor David Kanter in 1994, who had been studying environmental psychology and then found a link between an offender's spatial behaviors and their cognitive map, which is a person's awareness of where they live, frequent and pass through. I will take you through some of the main areas of investigative psychology in this series. Welcome! Investigative psychology is based on the scientific method of identifying patterns and commonalities across a range of offenders' behaviors. So, when an offender made certain decisions whilst they were committing a crime, we can try to find out what other offenders who made similar decisions in similar situations had in common with each other. This could be their gender, age range, their relationship to the victim or the location, or their previous criminal experience, for example. We can then say that it is likely that the offender we're looking for perhaps also has that particular aspect in common with these other offenders that have already been caught for similar crimes. If you are an experienced investigator, have you noticed that people who commit certain kinds of offenses have something in common with each other? What was it? Let's work through an example. To establish a pattern that might help in investigations, researchers looked at a large number of different offenses that were already solved. The symbols within each offense represent an offense feature. For example, was it a robbery or a rape? Was it committed outdoors or indoors? Was it committed by a stranger or someone known to the victim? Was violence used simply to get the victim to comply, or was it used because the offender really wanted to be that violent? There are many other potential offense features, so this is just a small sub-selection. Researchers then selected one of those offense features and looked at offenders who had been convicted to see what those whose crimes exhibited that same offense feature had in common with each other. This again might have been their gender, age range, previous criminal experience, or specific mental health problem, for example. Now, based on this connection between the offense feature and the perpetrator feature, we can infer that the unknown offender that we're looking for has some of these same features in common with other perpetrators. This could give investigations a starting point for their inquiries. In fact, the more similar certain features of the crime are, the more similar some of the background characteristics of the offenders who have committed those crimes are likely to be. We call this homology, which means sameness. For example, in a case where an offender decides to commit an outdoor rape of a woman he doesn't know, which we call a stranger rape, it has been established through previous outdoor stranger rape cases that he is likely to have a generally criminal lifestyle and to have previous convictions for a range of offenses, not just those of a sexual nature. That is the pattern that has been identified from a large number of previous outdoor stranger rape offenses and those who commit them. If you are dealing with such a rape case then, make sure you don't limit your initial searches to only sexual offenders. Your perpetrator might not be on that list. However, a man who commits a stranger rape and then kills the woman deliberately, by that I mean not through panic or escalation, is likely to have an actual conviction for rape. Once the investigating team know this, they can prioritize their list of potential suspects to start with convicted rapists. However, they should never exclude a potential suspect from their investigations just because they don't have a rape conviction. And there are two reasons for that. One, it is actually quite difficult to get a conviction for a rapist, which means that there are many rapists out there who have not been convicted for this offense. And two, investigative psychology deals with probabilities like any other social science and cannot state in absolute terms that the offender we're looking for definitely has a particular attribute. It is just more or less likely based on other similar cases. Therefore, investigative psychology is to be used as intelligence and guidance, but cannot be used as evidence for or against anyone. Research carried out on serial killers found that the most common factor that led to the apprehension of the offender was the knowledge that they had been involved in a previous crime. So this information on previous criminal history could be very useful. That is because if they have a conviction, they are on a police database. How do you make these comparisons between what you can glean from a crime scene and what you can find out about previous offenders who have behaved in a similar way? Unfortunately, most of that information is not accessible to normal practitioners. One of the main sources of such case information is the VICLAS database, the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System. This is a database of violent crime devised and maintained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Many other countries subscribe to it as well, and it enables investigators to pass on very detailed information that is known on a crime, which is then fed into the database. It can then be analyzed how common certain behaviors are, whether the crime might be linked to another case on the database, and what is known about individuals who exhibit certain behaviors that have been input onto the database. The other way you could find out about research is through academic journals, but most of them are not accessible for free, and those who can access them are mainly staff or students at universities. I'm sorry this is bad news, but that's one of the reasons why Dr. IPIP came into existence. I will pass on relevant articles and pieces of research I come across to everyone who has an interest in it for free. Offender profiling is a prioritization tool. When the police are looking for an unknown offender, in a similar vein to how you might look for a needle in a haystack, effective profiling suggests to the police which out of the many haystacks they should look in first, based on a behavioral analysis of the case. Whilst offender profiling has been portrayed as this very mysterious and glamorous thing that near psychic people do in films and TV shows, in real life there have been a number of successes and a number of failures. Investigative psychology encompasses a lot more than offender profiling, but even that it does with a scientific method behind it. In the UK, the people who do the actual offender profiling, the National Crime Agency's behavioral investigative advisors, used offender profiling as only one of the tools they offer police forces amongst several others. Providing behavioral investigative advice is the practice of using the individual characteristics of the offense as well as the unknown offender's behavior and choices that can be gleaned from the crime site or the victim's account to advance the investigation. Offense characteristics are features such as how, with what, and against whom the offense was committed. For example, does it appear to have been carried out spontaneously or was it pre-planned? Does the perpetrator seem to have experience in offending, etc.? The unknown offender's behavior and decision-making is really what the BIA is trying to get at, as this could help narrow down or prioritize a potentially long list of suspects. For example, if we could go from something as general as a male who was in the area at the time, which could be a nightmare to investigate, to something more specific, such as a male who knows the area very well. He is likely to have had a personal relationship with the victim whom he targeted specifically. He is likely to have planned out the offense in detail and did so with precision and no mistakes, and that might imply he has previous criminal experience, and he is likely to have access to the specific tools he used in the offense. Well, that would be so much better. In that case, police might have a starting point and could prioritize investigating males who fit that description. So, the BIA would be looking at what did the offender do and why, and what did they not do, even though they could have done it. The choices the perpetrator made need to be extracted if at all possible. Why did they do A, E, and F, but not B, C, or D? So the offender profile is used for prioritizing unknown suspects, but in order to create a profile, careful behavioral analysis has to take place. It is not about predicting an offender's personality, and it is only useful if the characteristics it ascribes to the perpetrator are something the police are able to look up or use to select whom to investigate first. and personality is not usually recorded on a database, nor is whether the offender has an unresolved issue with his sexuality. So the inferences made need to be a lot more practical than that in order to be useful to the police. In the olden days, investigative interviews, also known as suspect interviews or interrogations, were very coercive processes in which accusations were shouted at the detainee, who was also sometimes subjected to violence and intimidation by the interrogator. Whilst this is still the case today in some countries, and make sure you never get arrested there, interviewing practice in the UK is much more evidence-based now, which means it employs methods that have been shown to work better. By work, I mean not scaring innocent people into taking the blame for something they haven't done, and enabling interviewers to try and identify when someone seems to be lying, at least in theory. There has been a lot of research in investigative psychology dealing with the psychology of suspect interviews in the past few decades. Gisli Gudjonsson describes how coercive and intimidating tactics may result in false confessions. Such interviewing styles raise the suspect's level of anxiety, which can increase their uncertainty and doubt about what they have experienced. At the same time, they become more sensitive to the interviewer's reactions as they look for signals from their interrogator that the responses they provide are acceptable and their discomfort might be coming to an end. This might lead them to tailor their responses towards gaining approval or avoiding further accusations by agreeing with what the interviewer suggests. Through this process, the suspect's goal can shift from providing their true version of events to getting a favorable reaction from the interviewer more than anything else. So you want to make sure you make the interviewee feel safe and that you do not come across as intimidating or pushy in any way. It has also been shown that interviewers get better cooperation and more evidence from suspects when they are non-judgmental towards them and when they use empathy and rapport in suspect interviews. So, be sure to build rapport with your suspect from the very beginning and to maintain it, and there are at least 3 reasons for why you should do so. 1. They might actually be innocent. 2. If they are not innocent, your job is to make it easier for them to be honest with you. Do your best to enable them to tell you what really happened by letting them know, through how you talk to them, that you will not judge or humiliate them for any of their actions. 3. They are a human being and should be treated with respect. What is rapport and how do you build it? It's a connection between people who just get on. Show that you are on a level with them rather than coming across as authoritative. Be genuine, be respectful and understanding and show concern for their well-being. Acknowledge that you appreciate they are in an uncomfortable situation and that you will do your best to make it as little unpleasant as possible. Explain the process and the caution, etc. thoughtfully. Check they have understood it, because most of the time they haven't. And explain that you are not here to judge, but to establish what happened. Tell them that they are free to decide to what extent they want to help you out and cooperate. In a study with child molesters, it was found when incarcerated offenders were interviewed by researchers that an extremely autonomous, which means self-determining, approach actually encouraged disclosure. The researchers emphasized the convicts' autonomy and explained they did not need to discuss anything they did not feel comfortable discussing, and they even asked if the prisoners wanted to stop when they appeared uncomfortable. That way, they got more out of them. And then there's a whole section of investigative psychology that looks at how to detect deception in interviews. Now, here's a hint. It's not when they look nervous. They're all nervous. I'd be nervous if I'd been arrested, detained, and was getting interviewed for something. Investigative psychology is often used when trying to identify an unknown offender or when trying to identify more offenses that could have been committed by a specific offender. However, in most rape cases, for example, the offender is someone the victim knows. In investigative terms, the task then is not to identify that person, but to prove that the sexual act took place without the victim's consent. Investigative psychology can then be used differently, for example by helping investigators understand how best to interview the victim. Rape victims are under immense pressure, and the emotions they experience might include trauma, a mix of fear, guilt and disgust, anxiety with regards to the perpetrator, how people such as her family and friends will respond to her, the criminal justice process, speaking to police, going to court and many other things. It is also not straightforward to interview a suspected rapist, as investigative interviews in and of themselves are very complex matters, but rapists in particular often experience cognitive distortions. These are influences on their thought processes and reasoning that allow the perpetrator to minimize or simply deny their guilt or misrepresent the part the victim played in it in their own mind. Investigative psychology can educate investigators and help them in their decision-making on how best to navigate these emotional challenges in victims and suspects in order to interview them as best they can. With the rape suspect, focus on the actual step-by-step behaviors and reactions of both parties. Ask the suspect what they did and how the alleged victim responded. What does the suspect think this meant? Why did she react in the way she did? Then try to ask questions about the victim's perspective. If he was her, how would he have felt? How could she have interpreted the situation or the offender's actions? Is it possible that she might have seen things differently to how the suspect might have seen them, for example, or to how he thought she had seen them? If you have a defense solicitor in the interview room with you, they might interject and state that their client could not possibly guess how the complainant might have felt. In that case, respectfully and calmly remind the solicitor that their client has already stated what he thought was going through the victim's mind and how his actions were seen by her, and that you are simply trying, together with the client, to see the incident from the other party's perspective. Don't believe the solicitor when they try to tell you that you can't ask that question. They did try to say that to me sometimes. And you can ask any question you feel is relevant. Your questions might help you and their client clarify what happened. Respectfully remind the solicitor, if they are still interjecting, that it is the client's right to decide to answer your questions and that your questions are perfectly valid for this investigation. Try to establish with the suspect, once you've explored the victim's perspective and whether perhaps she might have read the situation differently or had different intentions to what he thought they were, how sure the client is now that she actually wanted him to do what he did. If he is starting to doubt that his initial confident assertion that it was all mutual is still correct, explore this doubt further. For example, you could ask why he is now not so sure anymore. How would he have felt in her place, and then probe his response for further information. Maintain an atmosphere of empathy and respect at all times. This is a very difficult time for the suspect, and an interview is not a way for you to score points and feel empowered, but to level with the person and get an honest account from them. With the rape victim, when you are trying to get their account, all the different emotions they might be flooded with are the paramount obstacle to their ability to give you clear evidence. And actually, don't expect the account to be clear or consistent or in chronological order or logical. You are not dealing with a renowned scientist who is calmly and proudly explaining her research to you. You are dealing with someone who has been completely traumatized, so just accept that the evidence you want to get from her is not going to come out gift-wrapped and neatly typed up in black and white in a way that you would want it. Make sure you acknowledge the horrible emotions she is experiencing. Explain that you are here to listen and to help her tell you what has happened to her. Tell her you will not rush her and that she is safe and that she will be taken seriously and that everything she can tell you might be important evidence, so she should not leave anything out. Be very empathetic and respectful and make sure she knows this is a judgment-free environment, and reassure her that you and your colleagues will do what you can to investigate her case, and that what she can tell you is the most important evidence you can get. It might also be helpful if you explain to her that in these situations, the way that victims recount what has happened is often unstructured and all over the place, and that she should not let this stop her. Eyewitness testimony is the evidence that you get from someone who has witnessed a crime. Instinctively, people tend to believe and rely on it to a great extent. It can be seen as a factor that can sway a judge and/or jury to establish the guilt or innocence of a defendant. It is often used in the initial stages of an investigation, for example when a witness reports the perpetrator was of a certain appearance. Then the police will be looking for potential suspects who match that description. Witnesses' evidence is also used in court when either the prosecution or defense try to convince the jury that a certain person is or is not guilty. However, whilst in the past the criminal justice process has relied greatly on eyewitness accounts and still does, over the past few decades we have learned more and more about how unreliable this kind of evidence can be. It took DNA evidence to exonerate a number of innocent people who had been convicted based on eyewitness evidence. And mistakes made unwittingly by eyewitnesses are a substantial cause of wrongful convictions. It would be great if memory worked like a camera that records images, video and sound as they are and stores them safely in a drawer to be retrieved and replayed showing exactly how the situation happened. But that is not the case. There are many factors that influence how information is encoded into our memory, and that can be a false representation at this stage already. In addition, with the passage of time, memories are likely to be altered even further. And then it also depends on the conditions under which a witness is required to retrieve and recount a memory, which might alter the original memory even further. Our brain cannot always distinguish between a memory of something that happened and something that we imagined. Also, memories can be unconsciously transferred, such that we believe that we saw a person in situation A, when really we saw them in situation B. In general, but not always, the more certain a witness is of the accuracy of their testimony, the more likely it is to be correct. Research on memories has been taking place before the field of investigative psychology materialized. However, one feeds into the other. With a better understanding of how memory can be affected, investigative psychology can help avoid labeling witnesses or victims as unreliable when their true testimony is not clear or consistent, and can also help avoid misleading them with bad interview techniques and questions. The cognitive interview has been developed to enable witnesses to recount more correct details without adversely affecting the memory's accuracy. Specialist courses exist that train the police in this technique. It involves making sure the witness is relaxed and under no time pressure. You need to create such an opportunity when you schedule your interview with them. Try to get them to reinstate as many aspects of the day you want to question them about as possible. Start by getting them to recount what they did that day. What was on their mind? How were they feeling? What was the weather like? What were they worried about or looking forward to that day? We call this context reinstatement. Then carry on asking about their perceptions as the narrative of their account moves closer to the incident in question. Be very careful not to make any suggestions that might alter their account. Go through the incident in this manner and ask open questions. Using sketch plans can allow a witness who is not comfortable mentally reinstating the context of the event to draw the layout of the event on paper and describe the incident using that drawing. It needs to be emphasized from the start of this interview that the witness should not leave out any detail, even if they think it might be trivial. This detail might actually trigger further information on the event. Crime linkage is the practice of identifying which different offences were committed by the same offender. For example, if you have a whole lot of unsolved burglaries, you want to find out which offences are attributable to the same person. That is because you might have some information about the perpetrator from one crime, for example a shoe print that points to a male with a certain shoe size and weight. See if you could identify which other offences you think are linked to that same person. Perhaps some of those have other information about the burglar, such as a witness seeing that he has a tattoo on one hand, and in this way you can put together more and more pieces of the puzzle. You now have good reasons to believe that the offender who is responsible for this particular series is of a certain gender, weight, has a certain shoe size which might point to his approximate height, and he has a tattoo on one hand. If you allocate one of those pieces to the wrong puzzle, i.e. to the wrong series of offences, you unnecessarily hinder the investigation, so it is important to link the right offences to the right person. Crimes can be linked through the perpetrator's MO or modus operandi, which is how he carries out his crimes. This can refer to the kind of targets he selects and what he does to those targets. For example, Jack the Ripper's MO was to attack prostitutes in London's Whitechapel area in the East End during darkness and to cut their insides. If another prostitute was poisoned to death in a different part of London during the day, that would not be consistent with Jack's MO, and we might therefore regard that as being the crime of another person. People are creatures of habit, and if we find a way of doing something that works, we tend to stick with that way of doing it, as we have learned that it is effective. A skilled burglar who knows how to pick locks is unlikely to kick the door down. He is much more likely to continue picking locks, as that gets him through doors quietly. So we're looking for commonalities in decisions taken by the offender, how and whom he targets, and how and whom he attacks, for example. We also need to take into account progression. A prolific offender might gain at least experience, but perhaps also additional skills during the commission of each crime. When he makes a mistake on one occasion, for example, that nearly got him caught, he might take care to avoid that or prepare for it next time round. As we are looking for both consistency across time, but also progression, it is important to identify in which order the offences took place. Criminals also tend to become increasingly confident as they continue in their offending without getting caught, so they might be willing to take more and more risks. Of course, the most reliable factor to use when linking crime is forensics, so that when you find an offender's DNA at every burgled property, you can safely assume he has been there. MO is another way of linking crimes, but it is not as reliable as geography, which I will introduce next. Geographic profiling is a major aspect of investigative psychology. It seeks to use offenders' decision-making on where and when they choose to offend, to either catch them in the act, prioritize suspects based on where they live or hang out, or to seek further intelligence and evidence on the suspect. Geographic profiling is able to infer an offender's familiarity with the area where the crime occurred, why they were there, by analyzing the locations and timings of their offences. It has been found that criminals do not tend to travel far from their base to commit their offences, unless their particular target is not available in their vicinity. The utility of geographic profiling really came to the fore in the context of serious serial crimes, when psychologist David Cantor assisted police in identifying the so-called railway rapists, who had devolved into murderers in the 1980s. In fact, many other crimes are clustered around the offender's home address rather than randomly and discriminately spread out, for example serial burglaries. As mentioned previously, offenders in general do not tend to travel very far in order to carry out their crimes. Younger offenders do so even less, and less experienced offenders as well. These facts have implications on how you might prioritize your suspects, if it appears that crimes tend to be clustered closely together but were not committed on the same day or night. So you start investigating those who live in the area the offense took place in, particularly those offenders who live closer to the first few offences than the later ones. An offender's first crime locations tend to be closer to their home than subsequent ones. So if you are faced with a series of offences that you are pretty certain have been committed by the same offender, she or he is more likely to have a base closer to the first few offences than the later ones. What is the difference between forensic psychologists and investigative psychologists? The forensic psychologists are perhaps better known, as these professionals are firmly established within the criminal justice system. They provide psychological treatment to offenders, make assessments on individuals, and that is both the witnesses and the suspects, mental competency or credibility, and provide other advice to the court. The salient difference is that forensic psychologists are more concerned with working with offenders after the investigative process and during their incarceration in terms of their treatment and risk assessment. Nevertheless, they can also assist in ongoing investigations by using their expertise in criminal behaviour, especially when coupled with mental illness. They can advise on how to interview suspects or witnesses with mental health problems or developmental needs, for example. On the other hand, the investigative psychologist's input is more useful before conviction, as they can focus their efforts on helping the police identify the most promising suspects, as well as getting the best evidence from victims and witnesses, in order to convict the right person. A forensic psychologist might then provide an expert opinion at court on the mental health of the perpetrator, as well as assess the level of risk they pose to the public when it is considered whether they can be released from prison or not, after they have served some time behind bars. So, here's a recap on this first series. Investigative psychology is a form of applied psychology and focuses on how understanding an offender's decisions and actions can assist in investigations. It also deals with police decision-making. It is based on scientific principles of identifying patterns across large numbers of cases. It can be used to identify unknown perpetrators and to prioritize suspects. It is more and more reliable than offender profiling. It can assist police understand psychological stresses on victims and witnesses and how to get the best evidence out of them. It can help police link crimes in a series. Geographic profiling is a big part of investigative psychology and the most reliable indicator when it comes to linkage, and also very useful when it comes to helping the police identify an offender. Investigative psychology takes place during investigations, helping police identify and deal with suspects, with witnesses and with victims. Forensic psychology focuses more on working with offenders and their mental health problems once they are in prison. Use empathy and rapport when interviewing suspects and witnesses or victims. Be observant about what you could learn from each offender. When investigating a series, start with suspects who live closest to the first few crime sites in this series. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main EBP Dr website on ebpdoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.